Welcome to IB Unplugged, a Cognity podcast for IBDP educators that tackles your submitted challenges and questions by connecting you with experts and peers who share their ideas and stories from real classrooms. Whether you're a seasoned educator or new to the IB world, each biweekly episode and guest aims to equip you with practical tips and positive inspiration, helping you teach with more confidence, creativity, and joy. So whether you're walking your dog or commuting to school, hit play and join a community of educators ready to learn, laugh, and thrive in your IB journey.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to this week's episode of IB Unplugged. For this episode, we are bringing back David Spooner. So for those of you who were with us on season 1, David talked about demystifying TOK. And for this season, in this episode, we brought him back to talk about education and keeping kind of this human element in the age of AI in your teaching and how to balance between the two of them.
Now, for many of you, you'll remember David, of course. He's a TOK teacher. He's a philosophy, English language, and literature teacher as well. He's led TOK workshops and he's written books and this sort of thing. And in this episode here, we're not necessarily focusing on any of those subjects per se. We're focusing on what does it mean to be an educator in the age of AI? So if you're asking yourself questions like, how many of these tools should I start to be using and why should I be using these tools with my students themselves? Or even just sort of asking yourself, like, am I just churning this machine to try to get students ready for assessment? Am I kind of missing the point of education? Then, we've got something really great for you with this episode here.
It's such a pleasure to have David back to talk with us on these topics, and let's bring him out onto the show.
Hello, David. Welcome back to IB Unplugged, our first repeat guest. We're so glad to have you back.
My word, John. Hi, how are you? I'm so honored to have been brought back for season 3. Are we on now or halfway through season 2?
Still in season 2, but tell you what, we're just so excited to keep chatting with you. And when we think back to the first episode that we got to do together, there were lots of areas where we thought, we could dive into that. We could have a whole separate episode on that. We could have a whole thing there. So we're really excited. And thanks so much for coming back to chat with us again.
It's my absolute pleasure. I mean, I'm honored beyond belief. I'm also feeling a little bit of imposter syndrome. But let's see, you, the two of you, one a cocktail waiter, John, and the effervescent Courtney. I'm sure you will put me at my ease.
No. Well, we're looking forward to it nonetheless. So we've done kind of the warm-up questions with you before, and for our listeners, or if you haven't already listened to the first episode with David Spooner, then by all means go back and check that out. It's really quite a gem. So as such, we'll kind of skip some of the normal warm-up questions, and now let's get a little bit more into the heart of some of these things here. And specifically, I want to know, because the last time we spoke, I thought there was so much richness to what you were talking about, and specifically around TOK and what we can do as educators. And so I'm just interested to know, where do you find the most inspiration and meaning in your teaching?
It's a nice question. I mean, and I think the answer to it also includes the word meaning. I mean, we live in a world where we are increasingly pressured to try to make sense of a variety of different stimuli. And we are constantly, what's the phrase? We're permanently online. We're constantly being saturated with images, ideas, content, and trying to piece together the various concepts that are surrounding us every day, trying to make meaning out of the various phenomena that we encounter every waking moment of every single day. I think that's the job of educators, to help young adults and even younger students than young adults to negotiate that, to try to find how to form patterns, to make connections, and to have or to encourage students to develop some kind of filtering mechanism that will help them connect those dots and to make meaning out of random series of phenomena that appear meaningless. And I think that's where I get my inspiration from, helping students to make meaning in what Friedrich Nietzsche would call a meaningless world.
And maybe that answers my question of what the point of education is to you. But is there anything else that you feel like is really core in this kind of meaning?
The point of education is becomes increasingly important. The point of education is to help young people to make meaning, to construct meaning in a seemingly meaningless world. And the point of education has always been to prepare students for the so-called real world, right? I don't understand what is unreal about the world of education, but we're constantly told that our job is to help prepare students for the real world. And increasingly, in the age of ever more encroaching artificial intelligence into our lives, the pressures on young people to be seduced by a device, a technology, which offers them the seduction of having meaning made for them, is something that I think we increasingly as educators need to help them to navigate. So the point of education has always been to help prepare students for the so-called real world, as if their daily 9 to 5 were not real enough. But the best way in which we can do that is help them to make meaning in the fundamental constructivist sense of helping them to spot patterns, to see connections in this kind of random world of phenomena that don't initially seem to have any connection, the one phenomenon with another.
It's so refreshing to hear somebody say that, because often when we start talking about what's the point of education, people will kind of go down the typical roads, right? Of, well, you got to be prepared for the economy, or you need to be ready for democracy, to be a participant in sociocultural sort of things. And so I like that sort of stepping back on just let's make meaning of what was otherwise a meaningless world. And I especially like that perspective of the real world is obviously something that anybody's experiencing at that moment, as opposed to saying it's somewhere else, something intangible that you haven't come to yet. Now, you've alluded to it already in this answer, and I know we kind of spoke about it in the previous episode, and those of you who've been listening for a while know we've been talking about AI quite a bit and the changing landscape of education. And so now I'm just interested from your point of view, David, as we go through these changes in this educational landscape, what do you feel are the essential elements that must stay? Not that are going to stay, but we as educators have to be intentional about ensuring that they stay.
I think one of the things that as IB educators we are sometimes guilty of increasingly losing sight of is that we're not in the business of knowledge transmission. And, when it comes to 5-year evaluations and so on and so forth, we can talk the talk and we can persuade the evaluators that, we are actually in the business of encouraging students to understand rather than merely to acquire knowledge. But in our day-to-day practice, I think this sometimes goes out of the window.
Right.
And I think we have to revisit in what you call this educational landscape. We have to revisit our fundamental commitment to our pedagogy and remind ourselves that we're not mere facilitators of knowledge transmission, because the knowledge doesn't need to be acquired. In high school, in secondary school, that knowledge doesn't need to be acquired. Where we come in is helping students to understand the connections between different, if you like, areas of knowledge, the connections between different ideas and concepts. The knowledge itself is merely the vehicle for encouraging students to understand the connections between those different areas of knowledge and so on. And we need to remind ourselves that we're in the business of helping students to understand rather than to know, to make meaning out of that understanding rather than learning stuff. And the kind of tech bros and so on, I think, want us to forget that. They want us to replace, and they're encouraging us to replace the centrality of understanding and making meaning with simply acquiring knowledge and then applying it. And I'm going to repeat, I think, something which is becoming a basic sort of axiom for me. This knowledge that we are dealing with in secondary school doesn't need to be learnt. It's not the acquisition of the knowledge that matters, right? I read a few months ago, there was a very pertinent tweet, or whatever it's called now, an X, that was very sort of mimetic, but nonetheless it stuck with me. And it said, using AI in the classroom is like using a forklift truck in the gym. The weights don't need to be moved from place to place. It's what happens to you while you're pumping iron or whatever it is people do in gyms. I've never been to one in my life, so I don't know. It's what you do while you're pumping iron that matters, not the pumping of the iron. And I was really inspired by one of your most recent podcasts with Jennifer Bransberg Engelman. And it changed quite a few things in my teaching. And it inspired certain reflections in my teaching. And I've been using her podcast with my TOK students because they all do economics. That constant challenging of axioms reminds us and reminds students that it's not about acquiring knowledge of Keynesian supply and demand curves. It's about recognizing the human in that way of looking at the relationships between markets and human beings. Whether you learn about Keynesian supply and demand is almost irrelevant. It's what you're doing whilst you're doing that acquiring of knowledge that matters.
Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think I do like the gym analogy. And I think that's something that we've talked about in a couple of episodes. We talk about it all the time at Cognity of like, it's so maybe dangerous is extreme, but it's detrimental to recklessly use technology in classrooms, because then, of course, if you use bad tech, just like if you read bad books, like not bad as in banned, bad as in like poorly researched, poorly developed, any kind of resources that you're using, if they're not actually helping learning, then what's the point? It's taking up space, it's taking up energy, time, it's stressful for teachers and students to learn how to use these tools. And I think that it goes the same with AI. If everyone's just going through the motions without having meaningful learning, then there is no point. I completely agree.
This really sets the scene quite well for what we want to be talking about today, because I think often, while I agree, and I would imagine many people who are listening will agree with you, David, with this idea of like the content is kind of the vehicle for the great learning and the great connections and the meaning making that goes on. Obviously, we are to a certain extent bound by an assessment that has a fair amount of content in it. Now, kudos and credit to the IB, because I know they are aware of these things and they're developing them and they're making adjustments and this sort of thing. And at the same time, it's still content heavy. Kids need to know a lot of specific stuff. And I think in the age of AI and its onset, the constant thing we're talking about is like, well, we have to ask better questions. We have to ask questions that aren't just AI-able, right? Things that students actually have to do the heavy lifting, to use your analogy, so they can learn from. And so it's really making us reevaluate. But I think this comes to this idea now, to what extent Are we talking about shifting the assessment model to try to make things a little bit more meaningful? Or do we have to kind of get rid of assessment in general because we are in this age of AI? And I guess to start the conversation off, let's dive into maybe this first part of like education, artificial intelligence itself. How did we go from assessment for learning as a way of helping students understand this is what I know and this is what I still need to learn and here's how I can apply this in different ways, to now assessment of learning, specifically with grades, qualifications, that sort of stuff, really driving so much of what students are trying to do as they go through the diploma program, get ready for university. Let's talk about that for a little bit. How did that come about, and where do you think we are right now in that sort of move now in conjunction with AI?
What a fascinating question. How did it come about? I think the seed that was planted about 30 or 40 years ago, right? This idea that we are assessing skills gradually got supplanted by the idea that what we are assessing is the acquisition of knowledge of subjects. And it's always been in the DNA of the IB that things like TOK will disappear and become a natural part of the teaching of other subjects. But whilst we're still siloing areas of knowledge in different subjects, from the inception of the diploma program, we were always going to end up here. It was inevitable that we were going to end up here because there's no real way to assess skills. But there is a really, really easy way to assess content, knowledge, understanding, ability to apply content, knowledge, and understanding to a range of hitherto unforeseen circumstances or phenomena, right? And at the same time, we've increasingly moved away, I think, from what the originators, or at least the pedagogical originators of the IB diploma had in mind. You know, Dewey's idea of education for creativity, or rather education as a way of allowing students to demonstrate their creativity, was one of the sort of founding pedagogical principles of the International Baccalaureate Organization, let alone just the DP. But that creativity has been slowly squeezed out of the diploma. It's been injected into the PYP and the MYP, but it's being slowly squeezed out of the diploma. And when we think about A.S. Neill's idea of student agency as being at the center of their learning, that too has been slowly squeezed out, I think. And so you subtract student creativity, you subtract student agency, all you're left with really is assessment not of or for learning, but terminal assessment of what they have learned during 2 years. And at the same time, I think Michael Sandel, the Harvard University professor of philosophy, has highlighted the kind of sociological part of this pincer movement, right? He wrote a book a few years ago called The Tyranny of Merit. And the idea of meritocracy has taken hold, at least in the Western world, over the last sort of 20, 25 years. And the concept of meritocracy is quite pernicious in one sense. I mean, it sounds nice, right? You have worked hard and you have acquired all of this well-being or whatever it is by dint of your own efforts. But the reason he calls it the tyranny of merit is that it becomes a very isolating philosophy for a society to propound, because it cuts the individual off from the rest of their society, the rest of their surroundings. I have gained what I have gained by dint of my own hard work. and nobody else has any right to it. But of course, nobody gets anything by dint of only their own hard work. You come to school by bus every morning. There are people paid to keep the streets clean. There are people paid to construct and maintain those roads. Putting in a great shift at school and, acing your homework, that's one thing. But you wouldn't have been able to accomplish any of that without the help of other human beings. And yet this concept of meritocracy is part of the same pincer movement that has operated to shift the focus to assessment for grades and qualifications as being the only measurable way in which student attainment can be displayed.
You see so much of that present with students and their parents as well. I mean, I think any IVDP coordinator or university and careers guidance counselor would recognize this right away. Whether, students are trying to apply to universities or something like this, and you suddenly have to do predicted grades, or you have to give specific merit judgments on here's how you can judge this individual on sort of this horizontal discourse of where everybody else is leveled out. It's like this person stands above this person because of these things. And then it becomes in many cases, one of the main motivators for young people, and especially for certain parents, when they're choosing schools or when they're looking at how well a school does, they're of course coming back to what are the grades and how well are they performing.
But they only care about that because it's then what university is my kid going to get into? I'm paying for this school to make sure that they can get into XYZ university also.
Which then just sort of fills up that earlier philosophy of like, well, we're educating for the economy. And it to me, it feels like when we think in that meritocracy, we think of the grades and that sort of thing. It's very much just, we're pushing back to make sure that you can be successful. In other words, you can earn some money and be doing okay in society, as opposed to what you were talking about at the top of the show, having the ability to make meaning out of many different things that are going on in the world around you. And so I'm wondering, especially now, where we definitely see a fair amount of unethical use of AI tools and that sort of thing from students who maybe are saying, well, if this is so meritocratic and I have to earn this particular thing in order to get recognized, to go on to a university, do this next thing, why not take this particular option to get me there? And you see, I think, where if we are so grades focused, our assignments maybe are not as strong, and they're not encouraging the student to think for themselves. They're actually encouraging the student to use an AI or some other thing to get past it. And they think of education as something they can just get past so they can get on to university and then to that next thing. There's part of me that just wonders, do we have to really destroy sort of this model of assessment to get back to the roots of what we really want to do with generating people or helping to create people who can contribute positively to societies and democracy and all this sort of stuff? Yeah, I feel this is kind of that urge. It's almost like AI has kind of given us that push of like, hey, either change it now or deal with what we're gonna see from our students.
Beautifully expressed. There's I hesitate to call him a philosopher of technology. There's a technologist called Yaron Lanier, who he wrote a book a few years ago called "I Am Not a Gadget," and he has this beautiful phrase in it called "the apocalypse of self-abdication," and we come back to the forklift truck in the gym, right? Moving the weights about, acquiring knowledge is not what either exercise or education is about. But we have been encouraged, teachers have been de-skilled and encouraged to believe that because of this pressure from parents, from students themselves, from our colleagues, from our administrators, from educational institutions, because we have been encouraged to believe that the overriding purpose of secondary education is to get kids into college come what may. We have been encouraged to adopt a very, very utilitarian approach to assessment. Predicted grades are about data points that we can look back at during their 18 months of diploma studies, and we can mathematically calculate what really? We can mathematically calculate a predicted grade.
For a human.
Right, for humans. This kid is a 5.6 human being, so please accept them onto your course.
Yeah.
And we wrap ourselves up in knots trying to appease universities, where I remember we discussed in our previous meeting, we have to stop kowtowing to universities. We have to start telling them what kinds of students we're going to be sending them, rather than allowing them to dictate to us what kind of students they want. I mean, we secondary, primary and middle school educators have arguably one of the most important jobs in the world, and that is to educate young people, to educate future adults. It's not for universities to tell us how we should be molding or socially engineering 12-year-olds. It's for those of us who know what 12-year-olds are like to be telling universities, this is how you should be re-engineering your courses to suit the kinds of human beings that we think society needs, not the other way around.
It's I remember we spoke about that in our earlier one. It got me thinking quite a bit too, because I'm often one to go knocking at the door of the university and go, come on, you got to sort this out. And there's been some cool work there, by the way. I mean, for our listeners, if you've gone back and listened to things like the Learner Passport with Conrad and some of these other great ideas that are coming up that are kind of pushing at universities and saying, hey, we are going to establish who you're going to see. And at the same time, I'm also conflicted thinking, well, certainly I work with people at universities. They can be smart. They're intelligent individuals who know, no, this isn't the only thing that matters. And we do see ourselves as co-constructors of a society as well. So there is this giant machine, I guess, if you will, or giant system that isn't just, I think, on the admissions counselors at universities, but there is this sort of meritocracy, as you were saying, that kind of embeds itself. And I guess makes this challenge even more challenging, makes this problem even more difficult. But one thing I've really appreciated about getting to know you, David, is how much you dive into this idea of critical thinking. You dive into this idea of inquiry skills, really contributing to that human experience and helping people understand who they are and how to make meaning. And I'm wondering, is there a way that we can, if we focus more on that development of critical thinking, if we focus more on that inquiry skills, do we kind of remold things without having to just say, we're in a system that we can't break right now, or we can only marginally chip away at it? Does this development of critical thinking, inquiry skills, allow us to do that more? And should we as educators be pushing more emphasis on that, I guess?
It's a very seductive question. I like it. Let's flip it a little bit, right? The overwhelming pressure seems to be coming from this idea that we have accepted technological determinism as a kind of inevitable sign of progress, whatever progress means, right? So we need to have more and more ed tech because technology is the future and all this kind of thing, right? We need to be integrating untested, longitudinally untested ed tech into our classrooms, because in 20 years' time, we're all going to be robots or whatever it might be, right? We seem to have, and I come back to Jaron Lanier, we seem to have abdicated our humanness as educators. We seem to have abdicated our humanness in this thing. All of a sudden, every class, there's a Kahoot. I'm sorry to name the competitors, but every class has a Kahoot, or every class has an online quiz or something like that. But we haven't really stopped to think about, as you, John, as a biologist, must have done, the cerebral rewiring that much interaction with technology is going to do to the average biological human brain.
Yeah.
But because we are so seduced by this idea of technological determinism, we're going along with it. And we educators ourselves are using large language learning models to, I don't know, plan classes or units of classes. Why on earth is any educator using a large language learning model to plan a class or a series of classes? The usual argument is it saves time. Well, if you're wanting to save time from thinking about the planning of your classes, maybe you should not be a teacher. I'm going to be quite Luddite and quite demanding about this, right? What a large language learning model or even an AI can't do is tell you what it's going to be like to experience the class that it is putting together for you. It can't tell you what your possible experiences of running that unit of work in the classroom might be like, because only you as a human educator can know that. And so why aren't you constructing your class plans? Why aren't you constructing your own units of work? Because only you can see what the potential flaws are going to be. It's why I talk about AI and large language learning models de-skilling teachers. Because part of the skill, the art of teaching, is not just the 80 minutes or whatever of classroom interaction with students. It's the thinking and the planning of how that interaction is going to look over the course of that 40 minutes or 1 hour and 20 minutes or whatever it is. Now, does that mean that we should strive to prohibit students from using AI or large language learning models? Well, too late. That horse has already bolted, right? I think we spend a lot of time wastefully also trying to encourage students, the average 17-year-old, to ethically cite AI use in their assignments and whatever. That's never going to happen either, because they just don't, right? They try to get away with it. The more conscientious ones will. But most of the time, in my experience, they don't. And I suspect most educators like you and I and those listening to this know that students aren't going to bother doing that because they're probably going to get away with not having to do it. But they're still going to use AI. So it then becomes, when it comes to critically thinking about the effects of AI on human beings and human relationships, helping them to develop the skills to critically assess what it is pumping out to them and how and why becomes important. I was reading an article this morning in the British Guardian newspaper about how increasingly aid agencies are turning to AI generated photographs to use in their campaigns. And on the one hand, the argument runs that they're concerned about the ethics of using photographs of real human beings in conditions of poverty or suffering and so on. And therefore, in order to obviate that negative portrayal of people who are suffering, they're turning to AI. But the algorithms generating what some people have called poverty porn photographs raises a whole set of issues. Now, students and educators are still going to come across those images. We're still going to use them in our classrooms. But what's important is not the product, but the process. And when it comes to thinking about how we can use AI in the classroom, because we inevitably have to, I think we should be focusing more on the process and not the product. And I think sometimes we're focusing more on the product rather than the process.
Becoming a better IBDP educator is a daily practice informed through reading, research, personal experience, and episodes from IB Unplugged, like the one you are listening to right now. But sometimes the show can go a bit too quickly, or we can simply forget some of the key points once we are out of the car or back from our walk and in the office preparing for our next lesson. That's why it's easy to download the episode summary at cognity.com/IBUnplugged. Simply navigate to today's episode and click Free Summary to receive a condensed summary of today's episode, including links to other sources and other exciting bits of information you can use immediately in your daily practice. It's free and it helps. Now, back to the show.
There's a lot to unpack in that. And I think if I'm looking at the different pieces there, I think the first part where you were talking about like teachers using AI, I think there's a few pieces there that I think are interesting. In what I agree most with you is like the human part is the most important part. And I think AI without humans is not good in a classroom. Like, I think that it's super problematic. I agree. Like, it's never going to understand the nuance about what creates a great learning experience for the students. When I think about maybe what could be a good example is when it's what's the point just to save time. It's like, well, then what are you going to spend that time on instead? Is it I'm going to take, like, for example, with Cognity, I mean, David, you are one of the authors of one of the Cognity resources. You've poured so much time and energy into thinking of really great examples in the resources, really great learning experiences there. If you're then developing lesson plans using AI, but starting with content that someone like you or any of our other authors created, and then you say like, okay, let's tailor this to my classroom, and you make your whole prompt, and then it's like, great, I've now used like examples coming from experts. I've found a process that speeds it up for me, and then I review it as a teacher and I make changes based on what I know will resonate with my class. I think that's where it actually can become something positive. And I think that's where it actually can become a meaningful process that's not just dumbing things down, but it's speeding things up to then, if you're spending that time building out your lessons more, giving more thoughtful and productive and constructive feedback on your marking, things like that, then I see it as positive. So I think that's just one piece that I think is an important distinction. Where is it, okay, I use AI, therefore I'm a bad teacher because now I'm lazy. If you're not doing anything with that time otherwise, if you're not thoughtfully considering the way that you develop your classes, it's not great. But if you're using it in a constructive way, I do think there is a positive thing that could then transfer over to your students. Then you can show to your students that there are ways that we're not going to hide in the sand from AI, but the process, like you said, is so important to get it right and to keep the human parts in it as well.
Yes, I mean, one of the things that, aside from hallucinations and all of that stuff, right? One of the things which is true about large language learning models is that they never make mistakes, apart from hallucinations, right? They invent stuff which never happened, but more or less, the output from ChatGPT or some such is rarely irrational, and it's rarely wrong. It rarely makes mistakes. But what human being can be said to do those things? I mean, human beings make mistakes all the time. Sometimes I give really boring, terrible lessons. And sometimes students don't do what I have programmed them to do. And this is part of the experience of education, right? I mean, not every lesson can be a zinger, and not every teaching and learning experience can be, a wow, eureka moment. But again, it's about process, not product, right? One of the resources that I developed when we worked together ages ago for Cognity was a classroom activity called Poker Face. And as briefly as possible, basically it's a card game, and it involves 3 rounds of playing cards. And the students have to try and guess the hidden rule.
I remember this because I had to get because it was like, okay, we're technically producing something that's talking about gambling. Are we allowed to do? I don't know. Let's just go. Sorry, continue. I just remembered this.
So there are 3 rounds of the game, as it were, and the students in small groups have to try and guess what the hidden rule is that I'm using to either accept or reject their cards. And the kind of trick is this, right? In the first 2 rounds, the hidden rule is based on the cards themselves, either the numbers or the colors or the suites or something like that of a standard deck of playing cards. But in the third round, it's not based on anything to do with the cards themselves. You know, teachers can invent a stupid rule like, I will only accept cards handed by a male student with the right hand who is smiling. And because the students have become so programmed to think that the hidden rule must be to do with the data contained in the cards, the rug is pulled out from under them with that third game. Now, you couldn't possibly ask ChatGPT to predict what the hidden rule is going to be. And you couldn't possibly ask it halfway through the game, what do you think the third rule is going to be? But watching students and being with students while that rug is pulled out from under them, and hearing the recriminations and hearing the problems that they had with my structuring of the game, and listening to the whines and the moans and the "it's not fair, Mr. Davids."
Now I don't have lunch money, Mr. David.
That's right. Ka-ching. Thank you very much. That cannot be planned by an artificial intelligence, and it can't be designed because that on the ground being with the students is not possibly something that can be designed by any other program than a human program, I think.
What I actually like about that game, and one of the things you mentioned before, I really want to get in on that, was it reminded me of Jennifer's episode. You were just talking about Jennifer's episode with economics, and I think one of the key things that really struck me with that was the assumptions we make. And in her episode, it was all about, we assume that the market is kind of everything. And what you were just talking about a moment ago was this idea of we're almost assuming that we have to follow this techification of life. We have to say, well, we are going to become integrated with AI. We must do these things, and we have to follow this assessment model. And it almost prevents us from really thinking about it like a system. And as you're talking about here, education itself, these can be things that can be put into education to help assist this along the way, but we have to constantly be questioning whatever assumptions we might be making. And, like what you just mentioned, Courtney, I agree with a lot of that. You can use these tools that can help to make things more efficient. It's what we're doing with the rest of our time that I think really matters. And I know, just watching kind of the screen here, David, I know you were applauding that as well, that idea of you are freeing up time, and what are you using that time for? And I think critically, we've really got to get back to what are the assumptions we're making? What are the assumptions we're not totally aware of that we think are true, but we're not really asking that fundamental question, as we unpacked in your first episode, how do I know? How do I know that this is the most important thing that's moving us forward? How do I know that this assessment model or whatever I'm doing is going to determine if I'm going to be a positive contributor to society or something like that? And so I think, yes, use the models or use the things to kind of free up your time. I mean, they're effectively a teaching resource, but at the same time, think about what are we actually using with that extra time that might be there? And are we developing the critical thinking? Are we developing the inquiry, as it sounds like this, this poker face game really does, right? It develops that inquiry idea of why did that go the way it did? And I thought it was going this way. Well, let's unpack that. Why did you think it was going that way? And how can we apply that to our own lives right now? Why do we think that education or knowledge or assessments for that matter are going to stop being useful because now there's this tool that exists. So I think it kind of leads us on to maybe one of the last things I want to kind of bring up or that we could talk about in this particular episode. And that's just this idea of how are we staying human in that landscape of the modern education? How are we going to evolve as a society in the age of AI? What sort of assumptions do we need to, question and pull the rug out from under so that we can have a better idea of what we are actually learning, what we're trying to develop young people to be contributors for?
I think my answer to that is contained in your question, John. And again, we come back to the podcast that inspired me with Jennifer, right? And also Wakanyi Hoffman's podcast, which was also inspiring to me and which I've used in the classroom also. I created a TOK task for my students with that podcast. So this is where most of the hits for your podcasts are coming from. I'm using them all in my classroom. The questioning of assumptions. In the poker face game, there were a few rules, but there wasn't a rule about collaboration. And so because I divided the students into groups, they assumed that the whole thing was competitive, and therefore they had to compete with each other and hide information from each other. But there was no rule saying that they couldn't just combine their resources. Had they done so, the game would have been over in 2 seconds flat, right? But the assumption there was that we have to be competitive. The assumption behind the use of EdTech is that it helps to give our students an edge. The assumption behind using large language learning models to give you ideas for an essay, which you then take and rewrite in your own words and whatever. The assumption is that it gives you an edge in some way. The idea of asking a large language learning model, essentially John Searle's Chinese room, the assumption is that it can give you an edge in this meritocratic society that we have created, in this technologically deterministic landscape that we're currently inhabiting. But one of the assumptions that we are permitted to stop and question fundamentally is, why on earth are we learning any of this stuff? Why are we acquiring knowledge in economics or in mathematics or business management or psychology or whatever it might be? Why are we doing this when there's no quintessential need for that knowledge to be acquired? And by siphoning off or siloing out subjects into different areas of knowledge, we're discouraging the very things that the IB was set up to foster and to promote in the first place. The idea of transdisciplinarity, the idea of student creativity and student agency. And when it comes to, therefore, saving time, and why are we using certain things in order to save ourselves time? Well, the time that we save needs to be spent on thinking about those things, not how can I become a better educator of whatever it might be, computer science or chemistry, but how can I become a better educator of young adults, of 15 to 17-year-olds, who are going to shortly be inhabiting a world that you and I, when we were young, well, when I was younger, because you're both still spring chickens, I could never have imagined. And so we are at the same time nonetheless driven by wider society, by parental expectation, by peer pressure from our colleagues to believe that the be-all and end-all of our task is to get students better and better grades. But by and large, students get into the universities and colleges that they want to get into, irrespective of whether my kids all get a 7 or a 6 or an A or a B. They still manage to get into, those who want to go to university still manage to get into good universities. So why are we spending time trying to become better teachers of increasingly niche, narrow subjects, rather than questioning the very assumptions of those subjects and their place in society? I think Jennifer mentioned the Indian thinker and economist Amartya Sen and his idea of human flourishing. Why are we not spending that freed up time thinking about how better as educators we can promote human flourishing? The American philosopher Martha Nussbaum calls it creating capabilities. Why are we not spending more time as educators thinking about that? Well, we know why, because the structural tensions in this endeavor of education that we're all involved in pushes more and more to not think about that stuff and to think about grades and predicted grades. And if it moves, give it a mark. You want to go to the bathroom? Depending on how long you take, I'm going to give you 40% or whatever. and such is the pressure from the top, from universities into the diploma or A-levels or whatever it might be, that it rolls downwards. We then put, as diploma teachers, pressure on MYP colleagues and students to prepare themselves for the diploma. That goes down into the PYP, and all of a sudden we've got 6-year-olds with ridiculously large backpacks and 3 devices, thinking that unless they can get into Harvard for their MBA, their life will have become meaningless.
It's all based on these assumptions, right? And I think if we're not going to model how to think very critically about why are we learning, and effectively ask that question that you just said, if we are going to free up this amount of space, why would we want to go ahead and become even better at this particular niche thing? Why not? Let's just reevaluate, why are we educating in the first place? And that's kind of the question at the top of the show. And I think one that we all need to constantly come back to as educators: what's the point of this whole thing? What are we really trying to do here? And I think if as educators we do that more, it will naturally show up in our lessons as well. And I think that will naturally lead students to start asking those questions of why university? Do I need this one? Do I have to go to that particular one just because that's the one I've heard of multiple times? I think the more we model it, the more we'll allow students to think more critically. We'll allow them to be more inquiring about and to really ask those deeper questions about stuff, instead of just feeling like, they're Pac-Man out there just going through getting as many grades as they can so they can get on to the next, university thing. No, let's remember there's a point and a meaning behind this education that we're doing. We're creating meaning out of a meaningless world, to use what you paraphrased earlier. And I think when we really dive deeper into that, and we don't allow ourselves to just be thrown into follow the assessment model, follow this thing so that we can get specific grades. You are just there to facilitate and pour knowledge into this vessel that needs to spit it back out later on, but rather dive deeper into the meaning we're trying to create. I think then we have the potential to create a really bright future. We just have to be aware that if we don't think about it all the time, then we could very easily fall, just succumb to the path of least resistance. Say, yep, use AI, beat the assessment model, do well, go on to that university, whatever it is, and we miss out the whole human experience of the real world that we're preparing them for, or rather the real world that they are experiencing with us.
Today's Cog Tip is from Julius Krajnak from UWC Red Cross Nordic. Julius says, encourage your students to use Cognity's practice section. Your students have a great platform where they can put their knowledge and skills to practice, get automatic feedback, and compare their solutions. And as teachers, we can get feedback on areas where the class has strengths and weaknesses. Thanks, Julius. No, I agree. Because if we're talking about preparing for the real world, the real world has AI. And I mean, I've literally been in a job interview where I could tell somebody was just like reading notes off of something else. And it's like, no, I want the human answer. So, I mean, it's going to permeate into every part of the real world after school. So I think the technological determinism, I hear that, but then I also think it's like, well, while I would love to have no technology in a lot of situations in my own daughter's life, for example, it's like you want to be like, great, I want you to basically live in the woods for the first 10 years of your life. But then if we're thinking about it in a school context, it's like, at what point is it a disservice to not make sure that students can think critically about technology? And part of that does mean interacting with it as well, and interacting with good technology and being able to answer, why do I use it this way? What's problematic about using it in incorrect ways? And how do we do this in a meaningful way where I am still learning, not just using a forklift in the gym, and actually being able to be a constructive contributor and have original thoughts? And why does that matter? I think that's an essential part of also preparing for the real world.
I agree with you fundamentally, Courtney, and not but. I find the kind of ed tech playground that education has become a little bit concerning, right? Years and years ago, before I lost my hand-eye coordination, I used to play a lot of Xbox, right? And around the time that I was killing strange alien beings with plasma rifles and stuff, I read a book by a guy called Stephen Johnson called Everything Bad is Good for You. And in that book, he argued that the kind of moral panic over violent video games and so on and so forth was misplaced, because the skills that young people and older people like myself were acquiring and putting into play by engaging with such formats were actually very, very, for want of a better word, educational, right? Not just sort of motor skills, but the conceptual understanding that you need in order to play Minecraft or Halo or even GTA or something like that are phenomenal. And that's what he was arguing. All well and good. Now, the problem with AI in the educational setting is that it hasn't been around for long enough for there to be any longitudinal studies about whatever its either positive or negative effects might be. And in no other walk of life would we accept that as being legitimate, right? Except when it comes to technology in education. It's like the Wild West. We're taking anything that the tech bros throw at us and we're just running with it in the classroom. Now, I read an analogy a couple of days ago. If you walked into a cafe and a guy said to you, here, I've got some great drugs which are guaranteed to cure whatever, you would insist, quite rightly, on seeing the peer-reviewed publication talking about the merits and demerits of this drug from the Lancet or something. But when it comes to technology in education, we've already thrown our hands up and said, yep, give it to us. We will experiment with young people using this stuff. And it's like we've switched off our critical faculties. There we go. We've switched off the critical faculties, which normally would lead us to be initially skeptical about accepting into educational settings something which claims to be positive for education until such time as the results have come in, except when it comes to edtech. It's like bang it in the classroom and let's experiment on young people with it. And then in 40 years, we'll see what mush their brains have become, by which time it will be too late. Thinking critically about technology at secondary and middle school, even primary education, yes, is necessary. But engaging with it in order to think critically about it isn't necessarily, hell, I'm going to repeat the word necessary, isn't necessarily necessary. We can think critically about it sociologically, societally, and so on and so forth. But until the results are in terms of what it actually does to the human brain, I think we need to hold fire a little bit.
It reminds me actually of the episode we did with Gareth, and he was talking about when you speak with ed tech providers, one of the first things he does is, what cognitive principles is this thing founded on? And I know, Courtney and stuff what Cognity does. There's a ton of effort and research going into why does this thing work here and why are we promoting it the way we are? Well, it's based on specific cognitive strategies and things that we know about how we can develop that cognition and metacognition in young people. And so I agree with you to that extent, David. I think the idea of let's not just grab the VR goggles or grab whatever it might be and run with it because it seems fun. Let's recognize there is a tool here, but we need to evaluate its usefulness. And yeah, we may not have the empirical studies, yet I think it's still important we ask the question, why was this created the way it was? Why have you created this ed tech thing like this? What is that based on? What sort of theories informed this? And that might get us, again, it's that critical thinking element. It's not just accepting it as the thing, it's asking the question why. And I think we need to model it. We need to see our young people doing that as well. And yeah, I think in everything that we do as educators when we're with our young people, we're role modeling that, not just pouring in the actual knowledge itself. So hopefully that will then bring out more of that critical thinking from young people as well. Now I say that and criticize myself knowing that hope is not a strategy, but can be useful nonetheless.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. And I really do empathize with the points. And I really think, of course, it's so important to make sure that you're not just throwing random ed tech at students. That is so critical. It's something we've talked about in a lot of episodes of how do you know what a good tool is or not? And I think that John had a really good point of are there fundamental learning principles behind it? I know at Cognity, it's something that I wouldn't be able to stand behind working in a company that was throwing random tech at students. There's a reason why AI's been out for quite a bit of time. We haven't released anything yet. It's not because we don't care. It's because we want to do everything thoughtfully. And I think that it's really important on the ed tech provider side, of course, but also you were talking about de-skilling of teachers. I think one really important skill of teachers is also to be able to evaluate the tools that they bring into their classroom. Teachers got really good at evaluating textbooks because they've been doing it for a long time. They're pretty confident in deciding which ones are good or not, even if they're not peer reviewed at all. They're just released and there are quality controls and things like that, just like ed tech tools. But I think that it is down to the teacher to look at a textbook and make sure it's not just pure propaganda or a horrible, not resourced, not referenced text. So I think anything, it is also, there's a huge responsibility for a teacher to have control over what goes into their classroom and feel like they can stand behind it.
Yeah, which actually brings us back to that idea of using AI to plan your lessons and that sort of thing as well, right? What are we drawing this from? And am I asking critical questions about why am I choosing this way and all that? So, boy, what a fruitful conversation this has been, David. I mean, we've gone into so many different aspects here and I think had a really enjoyable conversation, really thoughtful conversation. And I think for me as an educator, I'm definitely walking away from this inspired with wanting to make sure I ask myself that question all the time. Why am I doing this thing that I'm doing in my classroom? And why do I think that's going to be a useful endeavor for young people? And how am I contributing to them becoming a positive member of society? And I think if I were to take anything from all the different things, now I think there's a lot I want to go back and listen to, but if I were to take anything from this, it would be definitely that. Just continue to ask your question, why am I doing this thing with students right now?
Precisely. And I think at the risk of repeating myself, it reminds me of one part of the conversation we had with our previous podcast meeting. The question is, how do you know, right? How do you know what you claim to know? you are using this piece of technology, do you have a way in which to properly assess the effectiveness of it? When you ask a teacher, why are you doing this? If the first thing that comes out of their mouth is because it will help them to get a better grade, then you clearly know they haven't thought about the broader overarching question of why you're doing anything at all in education.
Yeah.
If you're using this piece of ed tech or whatever it might be, this piece of technology, because it's more effective in transmitting some piece of knowledge, then you clearly haven't thought about why you're using it.
Powerful stuff. David, it's such a pleasure to speak with you again. And thanks so much for taking the time to come back and chat with us once more. It's really genuinely a pleasure for me, and I think for Courtney as well, just to get a chance to chat with you and talk about these things as well. So really, really appreciate you taking the time.
I enjoyed it. Thank you so much for inviting me yet again. I mean, I know the Cognity Unplugged podcast series are quite young, but I'm still really proud of the fact that I'm the only person to have been invited back. I don't quite know why, and I'm sure after today it will never happen again, but I've really enjoyed it. You forced me to think about things that we don't as educators often think about, right? Mm-hmm. We're quite unique in our profession at being very good, as we said before, at talking about the minutiae of what we teach, but stepping outside of that and thinking about the purpose of education in wider society is something that we're either reluctant to do or oftentimes not very good at or confident about doing it. And so you've inspired me today to think about that and to step outside of the confines of my own subject specialist knowledge. I hope it's been useful and interesting, and rather than just Spooner the gob on the stick spouting off a few opinions about things.
No, this has been great. And yeah, we've invited you back many times. I've worked with you for 7 years, maybe even more now. And I don't think you're going anywhere. So thank you. Thanks for joining. And yeah, great to talk to you again.
My absolute pleasure. Thank you so much, Courtney. Thank you, John.
IB Unplugged is a Cognity podcast hosted by John Patton and Courtney Marlene and produced by Catalina Gaffney. Be sure to subscribe or follow and share with your fellow IB educators. If you'd like to submit a topic, request, or question, please do so on cognity.com/IB Unplugged. Let's keep the conversation going and support each other in teaching with confidence, creativity, and joy. See you next time.